A Child's Christmas in Wales. This is a favorite piece by Dylan Thomas, which he wrote in 1952 and has been beloved in this country ever since. First, a word or two, for those of you who may not be familiar with his biography, about Dylan Thomas's background and history. He was born in 1914 on October the 7th. This was just a few months after the outbreak of World War I. His birthplace was Swansea, a port town on the coast of South Wales. Swansea, being on the coast, facing the Atlantic, has some rather unpleasant weather. When storms come in, there's a prevailing southwesterly wind, and accompanied by the rain from the ocean, it tends to be horizontal. Because it is next to the sea, the climate is usually pretty mild, but every now and again, snow comes, and it's pretty memorable when it does. As a child, Dylan Thomas was rather sickly. He suffered from asthma and bronchitis, and these afflictions of the lungs stayed with him for the rest of his life. He was often confined to bed to recover from his sickness, and he was certainly mollycoddled by his mother. He didn't get out perhaps as often as other children, but at a young age, when he did get out, and having exercised his imagination from his bedridden days, he was very aware of his surroundings. And some of this early time he recollected in a later piece written in 1942 called Reminiscences of Childhood. And this is perhaps a good way to hear of his early days. Here are a few excerpts. I was born in a large Welsh town at the beginning of the Great War, an ugly, lovely town, or so it was and is to me, crawling, sprawling by a long and splendid curving shore where truant boys and old men from nowhere, beachcombed, idled and paddled, watched the dock-bound ships, or the ships steaming away into wonder and India, magic and China, countries bright with oranges and loud with lions, threw stones into the sea for the barking outcast dogs, made castles and forts and harbors and racetracks in the sand, and on Saturday summer afternoons listened to the brass band, watched the Punch and Judy, or hung about on the fringes of the crowd to hear the fierce religious speakers who shouted at the sea as though it were wicked and wrong to roll in and out like that, white-horsed and full of fishes. This sea town was my world outside, a strange Wales, coal-pitted, mountains, rivers run, full, so far as I knew, of choirs and football teams and sheep and storybook tall black hats and red flannel petticoats. Beyond that unknown Wales, with its wild names like peals of bells in the darkness, and its mountain men clothed in the skins of animals, perhaps, and always singing, lay England, which was London, and the country called the Front, from which many of our neighbors never came back. It was a country to which only young men traveled. At the beginning, The only front I knew was the little lobby before our front door. I could not understand how so many people never returned from there, but later I grew to know more, though still without understanding, and carried a wooden rifle in the park and shot down the invisible unknown enemy like a flock of wild birds. There was another world where my friends and I used to dawdle on half-holidays along the Bent and Devon-facing shore, hoping for gold watches, or the skull of a sheep, or a message in a bottle to be washed up by the tide. And another where we used to wander whistling through the packed streets, stale as station sandwiches, round the impressive gasworks and the slaughterhouse, past the blackened monuments and the museum that should have been in a museum, or we scratched at a kind of cricket on the bald and cindery surface of the recreation ground, or we took a tram that shook like an iron jelly down to the gaunt pier, dared clamber under the pier, hanging perilously onto its skeleton legs. Never was there such a town, I thought, for the smell of fish and chips on Saturday evenings, for the Saturday afternoon cinema matinees, where we shouted and hissed our threepences away, for the crowds in the streets with leeks in their hats on international nights, for the park, the inexhaustible and mysterious, bushy, Red Indian hiding park. Never was there such a town, I thought, for the smell of fish and chips on Saturday evenings, for the crowds in the streets with leeks in their hats on international nights, for the park, the inexhaustible and mysterious park. So those were his recollections of the innocent days of young childhood. At home, he had been under the influence of his father. His father was a rarity in those days of his upbringing in the late Victorian and Edwardian era. He was a university graduate, and yet not from a rich family or from the upper classes. He obtained a degree in English from the University of Aberystwyth and became a school teacher for the rest of his life. He taught at the Swansea Grammar School, and in due course, that's where his son attended. From his father, Dylan developed a love for poetry and, in fact, started to write while he was still a teenager, and some of his early works were published. However, at school, he was not an industrious scholar and left at the age of 16. But as well as writing poetry, he was active in the local amateur dramatic society. After he left school, he worked as a reporter for the South Wales Daily Post and later as a freelance. He lived in the family home until he was 23 years old. Towards the end of that time, he did spend some time in London and met an Irish-French blue-eyed blonde, Caitlin, who was later to become his wife in 1937. After they married, they moved to Lahan along the coast, about 20 miles west of Swansea. By the time World War II started, his health kept him out of the armed forces. He began writing radio scripts for the BBC as his contribution to the war effort. As German bombing of Britain increased, Swansea suffered a 3-night blitz in February 1941, Thomas visited the bomb-damaged town. This may have been the event that triggered his writing of the reminiscences, which you just heard excerpts from. In May 1941, he and Caitlin moved to London, away from the Harn. And his work towards the war effort then was writing scripts for propaganda films with a film company and for the BBC. In 1944, the German V-bombs started to hit London, and he and Caitlin moved back to Wales. In 1945, he was invited by a producer of the Welsh BBC, Welsh Children's Hour, to write his Memories of Christmas for a broadcast. Later, he expanded this early work together with sections of an essay written for the magazine Picture Post in 1947, titled Conversations About Christmas. In 1950, he sold this composite work to Harper's Bazaar magazine for $300, who published it under the title A Child's Memories of a Christmas in Wales. It was well received in the US, and shortly afterwards, the American poet John Brennan invited Dylan Thomas to come to New York, where they embarked on a lucrative 3-month tour of art centers and campuses. During the tour, Thomas was invited to many parties and functions, and on several occasions became drunk. Throughout his life, Thomas had two passions or appetites. One was an eye for the ladies, the other was a taste for alcohol. They didn't necessarily serve him well. On his US tour, he was treated by the ladies like a rock star and returned the favors by treating the ladies as a rock star would, his groupies. On a later tour in 1952, this time with Caitlin, she discovered he had been unfaithful on his earlier trip. On the later tour, Thomas was visited by Barbara Holdridge and Marianne Roney, who believed that there were commercial possibilities in the United States for recordings of poetry. He agreed to make a 45-minute LP record for the newly formed Cadman Records, founded by the two women. On 22nd February 1952, Thomas recorded 5 of his poems. That wasn't enough to fill the LP. When they asked him what he would use to fill up the remainder, Thomas preferred a story rather than more poetry. He couldn't remember its actual title, but said that he wanted to read A Child's Christmas in Wales. Which had been published in Harper's Bazaar. On the day of the recording, Thomas arrived at the studio without a copy of his story. So they had to go and search for a copy of that magazine published in 1950. Fortunately, they were able to find one, the only one, in the archives of the magazine. So when this recording was issued, it became the most loved of Thomas's works in the US. And later, in 2008, it was selected for the United States National Recording Registry. stating that it is, quote, credited with launching the audiobook industry in the United States. He was back in New York in 1953. He was given a birthday party on the 27th of October, but he left it early, feeling unwell. By November 2nd, air pollution in New York City was bad, so he stayed in bed, drinking. This had its effect, and by midnight on November 5th, he collapsed and was taken to hospital in a coma. At noon on November 9th, he died. The diagnosis was pneumonia arising from emphysema and bronchitis. A short life, ending at the old age of 39, but one which will not be forgotten. You can listen to Thomas's recording of A Child's Christmas in Wales on YouTube, or if you wish to get a CD of your own, they are available on eBay and perhaps on other marketplace websites. But now for the live version. A Child's Christmas in Wales by Dylan Thomas. One Christmas was so much like another in those years around the Seatown corner now, out of all sound except the distant speaking of the voices I sometimes hear a moment before sleep, that I can never remember whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6. All the Christmases rolled down toward the two-tongued sea like a cold and headlong moon bundling down the sky that was our street. And they stop at the rim of the ice-edged, fish-freezing waves, and I plunge my hands in the snow and bring out whatever I can find. In goes my hand into that wool-white, bell-tongued ball of holidays, resting at the rim of the carol-singing sea, and out come Mrs. Prothero and the firemen. It was on the afternoon of the day of Christmas Eve, and I was in Mrs. Prothero's garden waiting for cats with her son Jim. It was snowing. It was always snowing at Christmas. December in my memory is white as Lapland, though there were no reindeer. But there were cats, patient, cold and callous, our hands wrapped in socks. We waited to snowball the cats. Sleek and long as jaguars and horrible whiskered, spitting and snarling, they would slink and sidle over the white back garden walls. And the lynx-eyed hunters, Jim and I, fur-capped and moccasin trappers from Hudson Bay off Mumbles Road, would hurl our deadly snowballs at the green of their eyes. The wise cats never appeared. We were so still, Eskimo-footed Arctic marksmen in the muffling silence of the eternal snows, eternal ever since Wednesday, that we never heard Mrs. Prothero's first cry from her igloo at the bottom of the garden. Or if we heard it at all, it was to us like the far-off challenge of our enemy and prey, the neighbor's polar cat. But soon the voice grew louder. "Fire!" cried Mrs. Prothero, and she beat the dinner gong. And we ran down the garden with the snowballs in our arms toward the house. And smoke indeed was pouring out of the dining room, and the gong was bombilating, and Mrs. Prothero was announcing ruin like a town crier in Pompeii. This was better than all the cats in Wales standing on the wall in a row. We bounded into the house, laden with snowballs, and stopped at the open door of the smoke-filled room. Something was burning, all right. Perhaps it was Mr. Prothero, who always slept there after midday dinner with a newspaper over his face. But he was standing in the middle of the room saying, "A fine Christmas," and smacking at the smoke with a slipper. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Prothero as she beat the gong. "They won't be there," said Mr. Prothero. "It's Christmas." There was no fire to be seen, only clouds of smoke, and Mr. Prothero standing in the middle of them, waving his slipper as though he were conducting. "Do something," he said, and we threw all our snowballs into the smoke. I think we missed Mr. Prothero and ran out of the house to the telephone box. "Let's call the police as well," Jim said, "and the ambulance. And Ernie Jenkins, he likes fires." But we only called the fire brigade, and soon the fire engine came, and 3 tall men in helmets brought a hose into the house, and Mr. Prothero got out just in time before they turned it on. Nobody could have had a noisier Christmas Eve. And when the firemen turned off the hose and were standing in the wet, smoky room, Jim's aunt, Miss Prothero, came downstairs and peered at them. Jim and I waited very quietly to hear what she would say to them. She said the right thing, always. She looked at the 3 tall firemen in their shining helmets, standing among the smoke and cinders and dissolving snowballs, and she said, "Would you like anything to read?" Years and years ago, when I was a boy, when there were wolves in Wales and birds the colour of red flannel petticoats whisked past the harp-shaped hills, when we sang and wallowed all day in caves that smelled like Sunday afternoons in damp front farmhouse parlours, and we chased with the jawbones of deacons the English and the bears before the motor car, before the wheel, before a duchess-faced horse. When we rode the daft and happy hills bareback, it snowed and it snowed. But here a small boy says, "It snowed last year too. I made a snowman, and my brother knocked it down, and I knocked my brother down, and then we had tea." But that was not the same snow, I say. Our snow was not only shaken from whitewash buckets down the sky, it came shawling out of the ground and swam and drifted out of the arms and hands and bodies of the trees. Snow grew overnight on the roofs of the houses like a pure and grandfather moss, minutely ivied the walls, and settled on the postman opening the gate like a dumb, numb thunderstorm of white, torn Christmas cards. Were there postmen then too? With sprinkling eyes and wind-cherried noses, on spread, frozen feet they crunched up to the doors and mittened on them manfully. But all the children could hear was a ringing of bells. "You mean that the postman went rat-a-tat-tat and the doors rang?" "I mean that the bells the children could hear were inside them." "I only hear thunder sometimes, never bells." "There were church bells too." "Inside them?" No. In the bat-black, snow-white belfries, tugged by bishops and storks. And they rang their tidings over the bandaged town, over the frozen foam of the powder and ice cream hills, over the crackling sea. It seemed that all the churches boomed for joy under my window, and the weathercocks crew for Christmas on our fence. Get back to the postmen. They were just ordinary postmen, fond of walking and dogs and Christmas and the snow. They knocked on the doors with blue knuckles. Ours has a black knocker. And then they stood on the white welcome mat in the little drifted porches and huffed and puffed, making ghosts with their breath, and jogged from foot to foot like small boys wanting to go out. And then the presents. And then the presents after the Christmas box. And the cold postman, with a rose on his button nose, tingled down the tea-tray slithered run of the chilly, glinting hill. He went in his ice-bound boots like a man on fishmonger slabs. He wagged his bag like a frozen camel's hump, dizzily turned the corner on one foot, and by God, he was gone. Get back to the presents. There were the useful presents, engulfing mufflers of the old coach days, and mittens made for giant sloths, zebra scarves of a substance like silky gum that could be tug-o-warred down to the galoshes, blinding tam-o'-shanters like patchwork tea-cozies, and bunny-suited busbies and balaclavas for victims of head-shrinking tribes, from aunts who always wore wool next to the skin. There were moustached and rasping vests that made you wonder why the aunts had any skin left at all. And once I had a little crocheted nosebag from an aunt, now, alas, no longer whinnying with us. And pictureless books in which small boys, though warned with quotations not to, would skate on Farmer Giles' pond, and did, and drowned. And books that told me everything about the wasp, except why. Go on to the useful presents. Bags of moist and many-coloured jelly babies, and a folded flag, and a false nose, and a tram conductor's cap, and a machine that punched tickets and rang a bell. Never a catapult. Once, by a mistake that no one could ever explain, a little hatchet, and a celluloid duck that made, when you pressed it, a most unduck-like sound, a mewing moo that an ambitious cat might make who wished to be a cow, and a painting book in which I could make the grass, the trees, the sea, and the animals any color I pleased. And still the dazzling sky-blue sheep are grazing in the red field under the rainbow-billed and pea-green birds. Hard-boiled, toffee, fudge, and all sorts, crunches, cracknels, humbugs, glaciers, marzipan, and butterwelsh for the Welsh, and troops of bright tin soldiers who, if they could not fight, could always run. And snakes and families, and happy ladders, and easy hobby games for little engineers, complete with instructions. Oh, easy for Leonardo, and a whistle to make the dogs bark, to wake up the old man next door, to make him beat on the wall with his stick to shake our picture off the wall. And a packet of cigarettes. You put one in your mouth, and you stood at the corner of the street, and you waited for hours in vain for an old lady to scold you for smoking a cigarette, and then with a smirk, you ate it. And then it was breakfast under the balloons. Were there uncles like in our house? There are always uncles at Christmas, the same uncles. And on Christmas morning, with dog-disturbing whistle and sugar fags, I would scour the swathed town for the news of our little world, and find always a dead bird by the post office or by the white deserted swings, perhaps a robin, all but one of his fires out, men and women wading or scooping back from the chapel with taproom noses and wind-bust cheeks, all albinos, huddled in their stiff black jarring feathers against the irreligious snow. Mistletoe hung from the gas brackets in all the fronted parlours. There was sherry and walnuts and bottled beer and crackers by the dessert spoons, and cats in their furabouts watched the fires. And the high-heaped fire spat, all ready for the chestnuts and the mulling pokers. Some few large men sat in the front parlours without their collars, uncles almost certainly, trying their new cigars, holding them out judiciously at arm's length, returning them to their mouths, coughing, then holding them out again, as though waiting for the explosion. And some few small aunts, not wanted in the kitchen, or anywhere else for that matter, sat on the very edges of their chairs, poised and brittle, afraid to break, like faded cups and saucers. Not many those mornings trod the piling streets. An old man always, fawn-bowlered, yellow-gloved, and at this time of year, with spats of snow, would take his constitutional to the white bowling green and back, as he would take it, wet or fine, on Christmas Day or Doomsday. Sometimes 2 hale young men with big pipes blazing, no overcoats and wind-blown scarves, would trudge unspeaking down to the forlorn sea to work up an appetite, to blow away the fumes, who knows, to walk into the waves, until nothing of them was left but the 2 curling smoke clouds of their inextinguishable briars. Then I would be slapdashing home, the gravy smell of the dinners of others, the bird smell, the brandy, the pudding and mince, coiling up to my nostrils, when out of the snow-clogged side lane would come a boy the spit of myself, with a pink-tipped cigarette and the violet past of a black eye, cocky as a bullfinch, leering all to himself. I hated him on sight and sound, and would be about to put my dog whistle to my lips and blow him off the face of Christmas, when suddenly he, with a violet wink, put his whistle to his lips and blew so stridently, so high, so exquisitely loud, that gobbling faces, their cheeks bulged with goose, would press against their tinselled windows the whole length of the white, echoing street. For dinner, we had turkey and blazing pudding, and after dinner, the uncles sat in front of the fire, loosened all buttons, put their large, moist hands over their watch chains, groaned a little, and slept. Mothers, aunts, and sisters scuttled to and fro, bearing tureens. Aunt Bessie, who had already been frightened twice by a clockwork mouse, whimpered at the sideboard and had some elderberry wine. The dog was sick. Aunt Dosey had to have 3 aspirins. But Auntie Hannah, who liked port, stood in the middle of the snowbound backyard, singing Cherry Ripe like a big-bosomed thrush. I would blow up balloons to see how big they would blow up to, and when they burst, which they all did, the uncles jumped and rumbled in the rich and heavy afternoon, the uncles breathing like dolphins and the snow descending. I would sit among festoons and Chinese lanterns and nibbled dates and try to make a model man of war following the instructions for little engineers and produce what might be mistaken for a sea-going tramcar. Or I would go out, my bright new boots squeaking, into the white world, on to the seaward hill, to call on Jim and Dan and Jack, and to pad through the still streets, leaving huge, deep footprints on the hidden pavements. I bet people will think there's been hippos. What would you do if you saw a hippo coming down our street? I'd go like this, bang! I'd throw him over the railings and roll him down the hill, and then I'd tickle him under the ear, and he'd wag his tail. What would you do if you saw two hippos? Iron-flanked and bellowing he-hippos clanked and battered through the scudding snow toward us as we passed Mr. Daniel's house. Let's post Mr. Daniel a snowball through his letterbox. Let's write things in the snow. Let's write, Mr. Daniel looks like a spaniel, all over his lawn. Or we walked on the white shore. Can the fishes see it snowing? The silent, one-clouded heavens drifted onto the sea. Now we were snowbound travelers, lost on the North Hills, and vast dew-lapped dogs with flasks round their necks ambled and shambled up to us, baying, Excelsior! We returned home through the poor streets where only a few children fumbled with bare red fingers in the wheel-rutted snow, and catcalled after us, their voices fading away as we trudged uphill into the cries of the dock birds and the hooting of ships out in the whirling bay. And then at tea, the recovered uncles would be jolly, and the iced cake loomed in the center of the table like a marble grave. Aunt Hannah laced her tea with rum, because it was only once a year. Bring out the tall tales now that we told by the fire as the gaslight bubbled like a diver. Ghosts hooed like owls in the long nights when I dared not look over my shoulder. Animals lurked in the cubbyhole under the stairs where the gas meter ticked. And I remember that we went singing carols once when there wasn't the shaving of a moon to light the flying streets. At the end of a long road was a drive that led to a large house, and we stumbled up the darkness of the drive that night, each one of us afraid, each one holding a stone in his hand in case, and all of us too brave to say a word. The wind through the trees made noises as of old, and unpleasant, and maybe web-footed men wheezing in caves. We reached the black bulk of the house. What shall we give them? Hark the herald? No, Jack said. Good King Wenceslas, I'll count 3. 1, 2, 3, and we began to sing our voices high and seemingly distant in the snow-filtered darkness round the house that was occupied by nobody we knew. We stood close together near the dark door. And then a small, dry voice, like the voice of someone who has not spoken for a long time, joined our singing. A small, dry, eggshell voice from the other side of the door. A small, dry voice through the keyhole. And when we stopped running, we were outside our house. The front room was lovely. Balloons floated under the hot water bottle gulping gas. Everything was good again and shone over the town. Perhaps it was a ghost, Jim said. Perhaps it was trolls, Dan said, who was always reading. Let's go in and see if there's any jelly left, Jack said. And we did that. Always on Christmas night there was music. One uncle played the fiddle, and another uncle sang Drake's drum. It was very warm in the little house. Auntie Hannah, who had got onto the parsnip wine, sang a song about bleeding hearts and death. And then another, in which she said her heart was like a bird's nest. And then everyone laughed again. And then I went to bed. Looking through my bedroom window out into the moonlight and the unending smoke-colored snow, I could see the lights in the windows of all the other houses on our hill and hear the music rising from them up the long, steadily falling night. I turned the gas down. I got into bed. I said some words to the close and holy darkness, and then I slept. And so we wish you a Merry Christmas and stay safe.